Want to use a PGR in your cereals but have no time for a separate pass? Manipulator PGR can be applied as early as one tiller. Just add it to your herbicide to reduce lodging, increase harvest efficiency, and maximize yields. Talk to your retailer for more info and to confirm acceptable tank mixes.
Thank you to our show sponsors, the Canola School, Pest and Predators Podcast, and RealAg Radio. Real Agriculture's RealAg Radio is Canada's only daily one-hour agricultural radio show broadcast across North America on Rural Radio Channel 147, Sirius XM. The show airs weekdays at 4:30 Eastern across Canada and the U.S. and is rebroadcast at 7 a.m. Listen live on Rural Radio 147, check it out at realagriculture.com/radio, or download it wherever you get your podcasts. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Agronomists. I am your host, Lindsay Smith, and I am super excited about tonight's conversation. We've got all the creepy crawlies coming at you. But of course, before we get to that, a reminder, if you collect those CEU credits, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists tomorrow morning. Let us know you took in the show. We'll get those credits rolling for you. And I can't wait to hear how everybody's spring is going. Here we are. April 29th, we are almost to the May flowers. That's right. Kevin says he's got some April showers. I think we all do in Ontario and even Manitoba, but of course not Southern Alberta, where our producer Jay is. It's just perpetually dry. Okay, so tonight's discussion, early season pests, and oh my gosh, I'm the two people that I have here are so excited because pests are going to be a major issue. I'm calling it right now. So they're going to be very busy. All right, let's bring them in. We've got John Gavloski with Manitoba Agriculture and Tracey Baute with OMAFRA. Hello, John. Hello, Tracey.
Hello.
Now, are you excited that it may be an insect year? Does that make your heart sing?
No, I am not like Albert, who's like, yay, there's going to be lots of insects. No.
John.
It's going to keep us busy.
Yeah. Oh, and John disappeared. So we'll talk to John in a minute. But okay, so just before we went live though, Tracey, we were going over just how far advanced potentially either, the insect species might be, our plants might be, just based on growing degree days. And we did run through some numbers. Hello again, John. Can you hear us? Can we hear you?
I can hear you, yes.
Yes! We got it. Okay, so let's pause for a moment. John, do you get excited if it might be an insect here, or does it still break your heart a little?
Well, I've got mixed feelings. For one thing, it's job security,
That's right.
and I do enjoy insects. I enjoy. That might not sound great to farmers and things, but I do enjoy seeing the insects. Now, at the same time, when you've got 100 questions coming in a day because people don't know what they've got or don't know how to manage them, that part sometimes gets a bit stressful. So mixed feelings. Love the bugs, but it can get intense at times.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so, and that is what tonight is about. We are going to go over, we'll try and focus on a couple key insect pests, but recognizing that we're open for questions, of course. We've got these two entomologists here that can cover all sorts of things. So, it doesn't just have to be about the pests we're going to touch on, but there are definitely ones that, are a bigger issue in the spring, and we're going to talk about why some of them might be more of an issue this spring. So getting back to that question of sort of where we're at, Tracey, I'll start with you as far as why does having let's start with the warmer temps first. Why does having more accumulated growing degree days by this point versus the 10-year average, and quite a few more, what impact might that have on some pest species?
Yeah, so based on even just from yesterday's accumulation, we are in some regions in Ontario about 2 or 3 weeks ahead. So from what the 10-year norm would be, we have doubled that in some locations. So that means there could be some good things and bad things. It definitely will mean the insects are out. They're rapid. They're very tied to temperature. So when the temperatures increase, their development speeds up, and so they're out and ready in a lot of cases.
Mhm.
Those that would normally be out by mid-May would have been out by last week even. So we should
Wow.
expect a 2 to 3 week earlier time frame for some of the pests. The positive is that the crop might grow quickly too. So
Right.
it just depends on the timing. I do highly suggest that you're not the very first grower in the area to plant because that's
Might
the
be
field
too
you're going to
late.
go to. But, we're looking, as long as it doesn't turn dry, this heat or cold, this heat will certainly help the crop get up quicker. So it might
Mhm.
not experience as much feeding, but that said, these insects are going to be ravaged and ready to eat when something's there.
Mhm. I got my first sunburn yesterday. So that's how warm
Yeah.
it was. It was hot and muggy and sunny yesterday here just west of Ottawa. I tried not to get a sunburn, but I still did. John, not necessarily maybe as far advanced here as Ontario, but Manitoba also is potentially a little ahead of schedule. What are things looking like where you are?
So yeah, on average, we've been about 3 to 4 degrees above where we normally would be for this time of year when we get our reports, the November to April temperature updates. So yeah, we're on average a few degree accumulations above normal. We're also in most areas below normal for precipitation. So above average heat,
Mm,
below average moisture, with a few exceptions.
okay.
So as Tracey mentioned, that'll affect the insects that we're seeing, their stage of development. Um, as far as the dryness goes, that is a concern because you don't want people seeding into the soil and having the crop just sit there and not
There.
emerge. That makes things more vulnerable to insects in several different ways. So, um,
Mhm.
luckily, we have been getting a bit of rain today, and we're supposed to get more tomorrow. That should help that situation a bit.
Mhm. So that brings up another question, and we are going to get into specific species and talk a bit about them. Peter Johnson is liking to show off how much he knows. So just we'll
Of
ignore
course.
him for a minute. Yeah. Yes, Peter. We'll talk about being leaf beetle in a minute. So the second part, Tracy, I'll start with you.
Mhm.
A lot of Ontario didn't really get winter either.
No, no,
So
that's pretty scary. Yeah.
yeah. So what does that mean for insects that, don't typically overwinter or don't overwinter well?
Yeah.
Should we be prepared for potentially big populations of those insects?
Potentially, yes. Certainly, and that was the case for a lot of regions. So those that migrate in will be migrating in earlier. I
Mhm,
think any that had a barrier, or let's say they were creeping up and overwintering successfully just in southern Ohio, for example, likely would have been more successful this year here. But
mhm,
Ontario really didn't experience much winter at all. When you look at
mhm.
overwintering models for certain pests, they've done quite well. And that's usually our break. That's when we usually get
Right.
a bit of a pause and we're able to actually kill off, even if it's 50% of what would successfully
Right.
overwinter. That's an improvement compared to one case, less than 20%
Right.
mortality would have occurred. So essentially, they lived the life over the winter.
Yeah. Yeesh.
Yeah,
Now, John, Jason Vogt so he's near Carmen, Manitoba, for those of
Yes.
you who don't know. He said he set up his diamondback moth traps for you today. Is
yeah.
is that is that early, or is this usually when you would be putting them up?
No, that's right on normal.
Yeah.
My instructions are usually to aim for that first week in May, but because of where
Okay.
May falls this year, first day of May anyway, either this week or next week is good. Now, actually,
Yeah.
this year, going a little bit on the earlier side, maybe getting them out this week versus next week isn't a bad idea.
Mhm.
One of the things I'm actually curious about, we talked about insects that usually get killed off by our winters, but might be able to survive this year.
Mhm.
So diamondback moth is one. It blows in from the south. Um, the prairie winters are pretty hard on it, and we go with the assumption that they shouldn't be surviving our prairie winters. However, we do have good, at least anecdotal evidence that in some years, some can. One year, we had a really warm March one year, and I put some traps up just out of curiosity. End of March, I caught just a few, not a lot, just a few diamondback moth in really good shape. So they obviously didn't blow in. They overwintered. So there is some evidence that under warmer winters, some can survive. Now, whether that's going to be enough to cause a problem or not,
Right.
my speculation is that if we have an issue, it's going to be because they've blown in. But I'll be really interested to see when Jason and other people that do set up their traps this week change them next week, whether we're getting any of these, even if it's lower counts, whether we're getting anything this early.
Mm-hmm. Now, Tracey, what would be some of the first insects you'd be looking at to be gauging if they overwintered or not, that typically don't or don't overwinter well?
Well, certainly, the black cutworm has made its way already up. So I would
Right.
suspect that some of the moths, that if they, again, like John said, overwintered, they'll be quite healthy and still pretty newish in the traps compared to those that had to be blown in.
Right.
And the problem with black cutworm is that they're arriving when weeds are flowering already, and like their floor of green that they want to lay eggs on is beautiful. Simply, it's been like everything's rapidly growing in the weed spectrum, so that gives them something to start with. Interestingly enough, there is actually an initiative to start trapping for corn earworm this early to see just how early they could fly in from the States. And again, there's speculation with some of the overwintering modeling that's we've been participating in, is that it's creeping up closer and closer to the Great Lakes to overwinter. So they'll be able to do some testing to actually see where it originated from, and then also even see later in the season if they're heading back or not. So there's certain pests that we just wouldn't even, like fall armyworm and others, that we wouldn't even bother trapping till midsummer, that I start to feel we need to start trapping a bit sooner to keep an eye on.
Just somewhat unsettling news. That's fine. To have all these, but
Job security, as John said.
right, right. That's right, Ray. You stole the words out of my mouth, which is frightening. But forewarned. What is it? Yes,
Yep.
to be yes. So we can be prepared if we know that they are there, or potentially that we are having these shifts in the population where we get more of these insects that are overwintering or are expanding their range that overwinters. And John, to that point as well, even just that if they're blowing up with a particular storm or a particular wind system, just actually keeping tabs on where they are. So, Jason, thank you for putting up those traps, and anybody else who's participating in any of these surveillance programs. We need them. So we are going to talk about tonight. We are going to talk quite a bit about wireworm and cutworm for sure. Yes, bean leaf beetle, and a few others. And John, I think we do need to touch on grasshopper. We probably will do an entire episode on grasshoppers at this point if it continues to be dry in Western Canada, because they are just such a huge issue for a big area. But yes, we'll touch on those for sure. And we've got some great visuals and some great things and some great slides to go through as well. So Peter Johnson wants to know about fall armyworm. Tracey, do we need to worry?
Yeah. Potentially. I think it's still a little early for them. And admit, it just made me feel very guilty because I don't have the traps up yet. So
sorry, actually, Peter made you feel guilty.
Yes, of course. But there's a chance for sure. Again, they seem to be staying longer. We even had winter cutworm in some regions again do quite well. And so all these pests, all of a sudden, we need to really focus on their overwintering success and determine just how far their range is expanding. And fall armyworm is one of them.
One of them. Okay. Let's shift gears a little to focus on cutworm, though, because not all cutworms are the same. I have learned this. There are many of them. And while they may have some similar characteristics, I always, John, thought that cutworms were cutworms because they cut off the plant. They nipped it and away you go. I have been proven wrong. So I was today years old when I learned that is not the case. So, John, that is feeding that we look for, but that isn't the only feeding necessarily that we look for. So what pest species of cutworm are we most worried about this spring?
Okay, so we have two main ones in the prairies, well, at least in Manitoba. There's more than two in the prairies. I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about cutworm diversity here because
Ah,
it's an important thing. Yeah, so uh, believe it or not, the cutworms belong to this group of moth called Noctuidae. Worldwide, there's more noctuids than there are birds. They're a hugely diverse group. So yeah, yes, 11,700 species of noctuids worldwide. And in Manitoba, we've got about 570 different types of these noctuids. Ontario's over 600, so hugely diverse. Now, of this group noctuid, there's several ones that we call cutworms. They're not all cutworms in that group, but it's a huge group. Um, there's probably a good dozen or so that could show up as a pest in any given year. In fact, the list is probably more than a dozen even, but there's several that are more common. Now, in Manitoba, the last several years, red-backed and dingy cutworm have been the biggest issues. Going further west, they get pale western cutworm and army cutworm that we rarely see. Oh, there's the nice slide. Okay, so on the left here is dingy cutworm. So dingy cutworm is what we call a climbing cutworm. So what they will do is they will climb up on the plant, start chomping away, but they very rarely clip the stems. So that's the way climbing cutworms work. They prefer to climb on the plant, chew on the plant above ground. Then when the light comes, they're back hiding. Now, as a crop scout, this is tricky because you end up seeing plants that have chewing if you're out there scouting during the day, but no cutworms and no clipped plants. So people don't always make that connection that it's a cutworm. All they know is something's been eating my plant. So that's where climbing cutworms like dingy cutworm can be tricky for diagnostics. Now, redback cutworm, the one on the right in the screen, um, that one is what we call a surface feeding cutworm. So when they're young, they will climb up on the plants and chew a bit. When they're an older caterpillar, more of the time they're going to just feed at the surface. So they end up clipping the plants. And when you're out there scouting, you see the clipped plants lying on the soil. You still have to dig a bit to find the caterpillars. So that's another category of cutworms, the surface feeders. And then we have the ones that feed just below ground. So things like glassy cutworm, pale western, never come above the ground. It'll be more below ground feeding. And then we have a fourth category, and the one Tracey referred to, black cutworm. They are a surface feeder, but in addition to feeding near the surface, they will pull the food down into their tunnel. They like to do their feeding in the tunnel that they have in the ground. So they do clip, but then they pull it into the ground a bit to do the feeding down there. So there are these different types. And again, this is where it's good to know what type you're dealing with because they do feed differently. And even for controlling them, if you're dealing with something like a glassy cutworm, which you would find in your cereal crops, they don't come above ground, much harder to control than something like a dingy or a redback cutworm.
So when that's and we have a clip, we'll maybe go to that in just a moment, Producer Jay, but um, you know, this is one of the issues with cutworm, and as you've beautifully demonstrated how diverse they are, I didn't realize some of them were shy about their meals and needed to pull them underground and eat in private, like teenagers going to their rooms. Anyway, that because they aren't necessarily in the canopy, what is our best defense against some of these? So Tracey, I'll maybe go to you first on that one. Do we have effective seed treatments? Are we, because it sounds like, I mean, a
So,
huge challenge to try and get ahead of
yes. Yep. So definitely, if you have a good history of these, then certainly a seed treatment would help. I don't necessarily recommend seed treatment for the occasional sporadic pest, unless you've planting into a field that you really couldn't get a good burn down, for example, for black cutworm, then sure. But with the ones that do at least come up or make more contact with the foliage or the soil surface, then you can actually have a foliar spray that then they can come in contact with. And that's why when you do those sorts of early season foliar sprays on the soil, you don't disturb the soil for 5 days so that there's a chance for them to come in contact. But that doesn't always work with all of them.
Right. Now, and that is also the key point there, is that, realistically, not every, finding of these necessarily warrants an application or even choosing the seed treatment, right? I mean, you're trying to match the pest and the treatment. But John, is this one of those ones that, because they appear patchy in the field, and that you could potentially treat parts of the field? Or do you still, in a bad year, would you still have to treat the entire field potentially?
They can be very patchy, and I'll just give you a situation that I went out to see a few years ago. Sunflower grower called me out to have a look at his field. He had some heavy cutworm feeding, but it was very localized. It was a very distinct patch. And as we were looking around, he mentioned that the area where the cutworms were was where his thistle patch was last year. And that made total sense because as an adult moth, now they're laying their eggs mainly in August, maybe a little bit into September, but most of that egg laying is happening in August. And they're a moth, they like a nectar source. That thistle patch would have been the most attractive thing in the field at the time. So that's where all the eggs got laid. It was a very distinct patch. In a case like that, you don't need to be spraying the whole field. If you scouted thoroughly, the rest of the field is pretty clean. They seem to be concentrated in a particular patch. Just treat the patch. Save you a lot of money, and we don't want to see people doing unnecessary spraying.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating, and a good reason to take care of thistles. I hate thistles. Anyway, okay, so let's then. This question does come up every once in a while, so I pulled a clip from. This is a canola school. The question is nighttime the right time to spray for cutworms? I believe this is Leighton Blaschko in this one. Producer Jay, if you would. Our sponsors for the Agronomists are Pests and Predators Podcast, RealAg Radio, and the Canola School. From pre-seeding, seeder setup and checks, to pest insect identification and advice on nutrient management decisions, to tips on determining swath timing, Real Agriculture's Canola School is a video series that tackles every facet of the canola growing season in an engaging and informative format. The Canola School is made possible through sponsorship by BASF Canada and Invigor Hybrid Canola. Check out more at canolaschool.com.
So if you're looking at a field and you see some patches that are larger, that might be an indicator of a problem that's already been going for a while. The other thing that you could see is within a row, you might see a number of plants, a foot or 2 feet of development, and then all of a sudden a little bit of space where you're missing some plants. So you may want to look there and say, what's going on? So sometimes if you're lucky, you can see plants like, I think there's one over here. You can see that I would bet there's probably a cutworm issue going on. They turn kind of a bluish color, purpling along the edges, and then they will be falling over. So they are not, if you were to look at the base of the plant, you'll see that there's some damage. If you carefully look at the plant, and if you carefully dig, sometimes you can find the cutworm there. The plant it sticks out like a sore thumb. It's off-colored. That one might be a few days ago that happened. And how do you identify them? Well, I guess because there's numbers of species, there's a lot of good guidebooks out there. But one thing I read that, kind of what makes a cutworm is, they will curl up into a C shape. That's one of there's probably other insects that do that too, but that's one of the indicators for it too. So that's one thing that's pretty important about controlling them is they do come up during the night. So at dusk is when you would want to be typically applying an foliar insecticide. The other thing about insecticides, there are products now that are registered that are not as sensitive to, they have more residual activity, so they don't only need to be contact, because the reason you would spray at night is because a lot of the products are contact in nature. Some of them are more residual in that you could spray during the day and you would still get control, and they would have a lasting effect. But the other thing about some insecticides is not only the synthetic pyrethroid class of insecticides are affected by temperature. So if you have these hot days like we're experiencing now, anything over 25 degrees, 28 degrees, somewhere around there, they become less effective.
Man, when I see
John,
that field,
yeah.
I think slugs. Wow, that field here would
There-
have slugs.
yeah, they're not as big of an issue in Alberta and parts of the prairies. Tracey, it is. I see that too now that I've been here long enough. But yeah, residue like that. Yeah, you'd think slugs, but no, there we have other issues in the West, Tracey. Don't worry. So John, I think Leighton does a good job, and Tracey, you mentioned that as well, of not disturbing the soil for those few days to let that pass potentially work for that residual for those few days. But John, what do we have to think about as far as, so maybe not nighttime per se, but dusk or something like that? How do we balance that with making sure we're not hurting our beneficials? Is that where the patch spraying comes in, or are we also going to hit some of our beneficials for cutworm spraying as well?
So patch spraying, certainly that does help. The other thing is product choice. We've got products now the seed treatments. If you already are using them, of course, that's going to preserve most of your beneficials. But of the foliar sprays, we do have those that are broad spectrum, kill pretty much most of your beneficials as well. We do have another group that is a semi-selective group of products. These are the diamides, and they will kill. They're great on cutworms. They're great on any caterpillar, any Lepidoptera. Great on grasshoppers. They don't affect certain other groups of insects, including the group that includes the parasitic wasps and the bees. They don't kill that group. So a product choice can help. And we do recommend economic thresholds because
Mhm.
uh, any field you go into, if you look hard enough, you will find cutworms. Again, they're diverse. Any field's going to have them. So make sure you scout thoroughly. Make sure you know the thresholds for the crop that you're scouting. It does vary with the crop, and use those thresholds. The other thing I just wanted to comment on from that video, he talked about giving it a few days. Um, Cutworms and all insects go through this phase called molting, so with cutworms, they've got these 6 different stages as a caterpillar, or instars as we call them. When they're changing from stage to stage, they go through what we call a molt. And right before they go into that molt, they're not feeding, and during that molt, they're not feeding. When they're
Mm.
done that molt, they'll start feeding again. So you could have this period of a few days where a certain percentage of your caterpillars aren't feeding. And it's not uncommon for someone to go out there a day or two after spraying and dig up live cutworms and be thinking, the product didn't work. Give it another
Mm.
day or two. Those molting cutworms may start feeding again. That's one possible scenario.
Okay.
And one reason why you want to give it a few days, just to make sure any molting cutworms resume feeding.
Hmm. Good advice there, John. It's fascinating to me, all the things that they do while we're minding our own business trying to grow a crop. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit to Peter Johnson just needs to know about bean leaf beetle, Tracey.
Yep.
And we've got a slide for bean leaf beetle.
Yep.
So producer Jay, if you would, we'll talk about sort of the timing and the life cycle of bean leaf beetle. So this is one of those ones that I'm guessing, because we're far ahead, is potentially going to be a bigger issue.
Yeah, definitely. So
Okay.
the population that ended in the fall overwintered as adults, and we usually rely on cold temperatures and actual winters to kill off a certain percentage, because they're really only at the leaf litter and just slightly below the ground. And so they'll come emerging, especially for some reason in Ontario, they're still sticking to a range of southern Ontario. We don't tend to see them up near you, Lindsay, yet, but I don't know why that we're not,
They
to
can
be
stay
quite frank.
down there. They don't need to come here.
but they love
Yeah.
legumes first. So if they can't find soybeans yet, they will certainly hang out on clover, and they will love alfalfa. And so I guarantee they're a week or two or 3 ahead of schedule. So anyone who is planting their soybeans early, I suggest you wait and not be the first. Just hold off a bit, and certainly take advantage of them looking elsewhere before your crop is put in. But for sure, I don't know if you can switch to the next slide, but they overwintered quite well. So work done back in 2000 to determine how successful bean leaf beetle can overwinter. Essentially, you accumulate from October to April 15th the temperatures that are below -10 and -10 and below throughout the winter. And so you need an accumulation of about, -600 to see 75% kill, about -200 to see 34% kill. And we barely, looking across southern Ontario, barely rate test 25% kill. So that's concerning. So that tells me they've done quite well. Now, there's always the risk, because we want to cover both bases here. There's always a risk that they run out of resources. They come out too early and there's simply nothing. But this pest in particular, like I said, can find other legumes and things. But some of the other beetles that may have successfully overwintered, they may not necessarily always find the crop that they need to feed on if they're very selective. So that's one positive thing, maybe burning them out before they even get going. But bean leaf beetle's pretty hardy, and I think they're going to do quite well this year. So I strongly suggest people using seed treatment if they're going to be.
So yeah, that was my next question. So do we have effective seed treatments for bean leaf beetle?
Yes, for sure. And then certainly too, you still have the ability to scout for them afterwards, even if you didn't get an insecticide seed treatment on, because you can target them with a foliar insecticide and still manage to get them. The threshold is still 16 beetles per foot a row. Which some fields in Essex County, for example, or Chatham-Kent, you can actually get that on occasion. But certainly they're at least something that you can spot. They'll fall off the plant like within a meter of you coming. It's a predator response. They just drop off the plants, but you'll still be able to see their feeding injury, perfect circles in the leaves or clipped off cotyledons, that sort of thing. And sometimes you can still see them scuttling to the nearest soil crack.
So now Peter's jumping ahead on me, but that's okay, Peter. I don't mind. I know you need these answers too. Is the threshold different for IP soybeans?
It probably, it certainly should be. But I would also suspect that IP soybeans are already using an insecticide seed treatment. So that covers their bases there. And again, though in that case, a higher value crop maybe not be the very first to be in the ground, especially if you happen to be neighboring an alfalfa field, because they're just going to move over.
I was going to say, this is one of those years that maybe being first is not being first. You will end up very sorry.
You're still going to get lots of heat for the crop.
Exactly. So, okay. So, but that does bring to mind, you also mentioned alfalfa weevil. So if bean leaf beetle wants to find some sort of source in alfalfa fields, would be that. And alfalfa weevil is another one that we often are worried about. So is our alfalfa potentially in bad shape here? Like, should we be out there scouting ASAP?
Bean leaf beetle tends to not do economic impact on alfalfa, but alfalfa weevil will. And they're very similar in terms of their degree days and ability to move through this kind of weather. So I'm certain that there are larvae larger than what we normally would see. I admit I haven't swept any yet, but I anticipate they're there.
Okay. So this is your reminder, everybody. Get out and check. Yes. So now this is, I want to touch on, because we're going to talk about wireworm, which is common to both areas. But I want to touch on grasshoppers for just a moment, John. It's certainly a large issue in Western Canada. Manitoba is included in that, although maybe not as severe as some other, I saw some just just amazing infestations in Saskatchewan last year where, I mean, whole fields wiped out. It was just disgusting. But there was also a tweet not that long ago about people seeing grasshoppers already. And I jokingly said it's time to bring out the flamethrower. And of course, everyone was like, no, they're not pest species. So, John, so you need to fix my brain on this one that, like, right now, are pest species emerging? Or if I see grasshoppers right now, are they not pests?
They should not be pests if they're emerged already.
I mean, now. Okay.
So just to put it in perspective, now grasshoppers are another fairly diverse, I'll say moderately diverse group of
Okay.
animals. So in Manitoba, we've got about 85 different types, and there's about 130 or so in Canada. Um, of those, say 85 in Manitoba, there's 4 we consider to be pest species. So that means that there's over 80
Mm,
non-pest grasshoppers.
right.
The reason they're non-pests is either they never get to big enough levels to be of concern, or they don't feed on our crops to any large degree. Um, there's several of these non-pest grasshoppers that instead of overwintering as an egg, like all our pest species do, they overwinter as partially grown grasshoppers.
Hmm.
So I got a photo sent to me, I think it was about a week and a half ago now. Somebody was out in a pasture and had these fairly large grasshopper nymphs already. And I think it kind of freaked them out. Oh no, what are we in for this year? They're already
Yes.
big. And so, yeah, we have to remember that there are some of these non-pest ones. He saw 2 of them.
Right.
So,
So also not
you know,
100. Yeah.
so that's right. So
Yeah.
that's normal. You know, if you're walking through the pastures right now, I wouldn't be surprised if you see the odd one of some of these non-pest species that overwinter as partially grown nymphs. And there's a few that where the eggs hatch out a lot earlier than our
Okay.
pest species. So the year being what it is, we had a very warm September, very late frost. There's probably good embryological development in the grasshopper eggs that overwintered, which will help speed things up. If we
Hmm.
get a warm spring, I'm anticipating probably in about 2 weeks, somewhere in the 2 to 3 week range, to start seeing the hatch of the pest species. This would be
Okay.
a bit early, even with the
Yeah.
warmer temperatures we've been getting. Um, but if we do get some warmer temperatures, certainly by about mid-May, which would be early on
Yes.
average,
Okay.
we could start seeing some hatch. Normally, it's late May to early June.
Okay. Um, Okay, so that's good advice. No one panic if you see a grasshopper right now, and a large one. It's okay. That is very good. Okay, so we've talked a bit. Jason Vought's got another great question here because we've talked a bit about pests that expand their range or end up being an issue where they weren't before. And certainly, for parts of the prairies, we've seen some like pea leaf weevil, and he mentions cabbage seed pod weevil, cereal leaf beetle, moving in from other areas. This is a good question. I'm curious about this too, John. The likelihood of pests coming into Manitoba specifically, are they more likely to say come from the west or from the south? And I say not
Good
from the
question.
east because we have the Canadian Shield, and so that's like it's a wall, Jason. So they're not coming from the east. I'm being somewhat facetious, but yeah, where are we most concerned about some of our pest species moving in from?
That's a super question, and you're actually right, Lindsay. We have very few instances where a new pest has arrived from the east. We've had several fairly recently where they've come in from the west. All the ones that Jason mentioned, pea leaf weevil came in from the west, cabbage seed pod weevil from the west. Um, cereal leaf beetle made this huge range
That
expansion when it showed up in
was
Manitoba,
me.
That might
and
have been tricky. Yeah.
that could have been Tracey, yeah, for all we
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
I have a feeling that somebody moved some
Right.
straw or hay, and
Yeah.
that's,
Yeah.
yeah, likely that's how they get moved around. Now, luckily,
Yep.
uh, I think the situation was noticed quickly enough, and very quickly we got the parasitoid Tetrastitchus julis introduced, and
Right.
luckily we really haven't had any spraying for cereal leaf beetle in Manitoba. It shows up, but it's not really a highly economical pest because of the parasitoid. But back to the question, I guess new pest species that established in Manitoba, we've had more recently come from the west. However, we do have some species that can overwinter really, really close to our border, but we haven't found them in Manitoba yet. Some of those I'm concerned about. One this year that I'll be really interested in is soybean aphid. It does overwinter in the southern parts of Minnesota. Northern parts not so well. Manitoba, there's no evidence of it overwintering here, but I wouldn't be surprised if in a winter like we had, some possibly could. Now that's my speculation, just based on when they did their model to um, make their line where it shouldn't overwinter above. We were getting winters with a lot of -30, and
Right.
yeah, this was an exceptional winter. So based on that model, I expect they might have overwintered a bit further north than normal.
Mm-hmm. Thanks to that jet stream. Sometimes it helps you when it dips down there. What about soybean gall midge? And then Tracy, I want to know about if we have these things.
Yeah.
But John, any indication yet? Sounds disgusting,
No,
to be
no,
honest.
we don't have any.
Okay.
I've never received any calls that sounded like they could be soybean gall midge. I've never seen it. As far as we know, it's never been found in Manitoba.
Okay.
Something we're certainly keeping an eye on, and we do encourage growers if you do um, see the gall midge itself can be confused with other
Right.
small midge larvae, but it's more the distinctive kind of that rotting around the soil surface on the plant. If you see
Mm,
symptoms that match up, let us know. We've had, I'll call them false alarms, where people have found uh, orange midge larvae on
mm,
soybean plants.
mm.
So far, it's always been associated with sclerotinia.
Oh, interesting.
Those are not the gall midge. Those there's other midge larvae that will feed on fungi,
Mm,
and there are
right.
some little orange midge larvae that we see on the canola plants, the soybean plants, where there's sclerotinia.
Okay. Look at that. See, Jason, they're eating the fungus. So there you go. They're actually friends. I have to, Tracy and John, do you spend, like, before you go to bed, do you read about, rare pests of North America and when they'll end up in your backyard? Like, how do you guys keep track of all the things that could move in to your
We,
region?
yeah, we stay connected, right? It's a big deal,
Yeah.
like the Canadian entomologists and the US entomologists, and we
Yeah.
try and keep aware of what we're all seeing and keep
Yeah.
each other up to date.
I'm telling you. I mean, job security, sure, but also, like, how do you keep track of all this stuff?
Uh,
Okay, so before we go to wireworm, because we'll maybe end on wireworm, I want to talk about Tracy. You sent a disgusting slide. Thank you
oh,
for that. About grubs.
I
So
know.
I was
I was
I
like,
was discussing
yeah,
with producer Jay before we went live how
gross.
gross just the word grub
Yeah.
is. It's a gross word. But grubs are see, look everybody, they're disgusting.
And
Um,
that what you have to look at to ID them. That's really the
Exactly. Is
problem.
that so I did not realize we had this many kinds of grubs.
Oh, yeah.
And that so okay, let's back up a second though. Do I because remember back in the day,
Yeah.
not that long ago when we were dealing with the removal of a certain insecticide group that there was a lot of talk about white grubs.
Yes.
Do I need to know all the different grubs, Tracy, or can I just be like it's a white grub, I'm going to class it as this?
Yes and no. I mean, they certainly do very similar damage. The
Okay.
benefit of IDing them to what they are, the species, is that you understand their life cycle. So the
Okay.
June beetle grub in particular lasts for 3 years. So that's really the only one that sticks around for more than 1 year as a larva in your soil. And
Okay.
that second year is just awful. And that's why, because typically
Mm.
grubs usually end up being more of a corn issue because you're planting corn early. As long as we're not planting soybeans early, you can avoid most of their feeding as the larva because they pupate by mid to late spring. And then they're adults again in June or later. And so, but June beetle, because it's got that second year of larva, you can plant soybeans and get pretty decimated by them. So it does help, but the others are annual. And one in particular that I wanted to point out was the Asiatic garden beetle, which I don't see anyone finding yet, or at least maybe they're assuming that they have other grubs and it's not that one. But they're currently in Ohio and Michigan and Indiana, and I don't see why we're not finding them in at least Essex and Kent counties where we've got sandy soils. So I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to looking for it and starting to look at the butt ends of their grubs again so that we can ID them and find them.
Okay, like I was envisioning that we were looking at their heads, but we're not.
No. So
So what do I need to know about this garden beetle? What am I looking for?
So at least the garden beetle, you can at least look at it from the front first. So on its face, it has these bulb-like cheeks. And the grub itself is a bit smaller than if those are used to looking at June beetles or chafers, it's a little bit smaller than them. But then you have to turn, and you can see in that top right picture, that's its head on the bottom, and it's a C shape curved up with its butt facing us. Then you have to actually look at the butt hairs patterns and the anal slit. So for Asiatic garden beetle, the anal slit is almost like a cartoon drawing of an umbrella or a sprinkler, for example. And then a very wide V for its raster patterns or butt hairs. So that one would tell you. So if it's got the bulbs and it's got that umbrella, then let me know, because this one doesn't, even the high rate ponchos wouldn't work on it very well, and they don't have a very good control measures for it. So it can take out corn pretty well. So don't just assume that that's chafer taking out your corn or June beetle. Japanese beetle really, they're there, but they're so tiny. They really need there's got to be a lot for them to have a real impact. But the other two that we're used to, maybe we're just assuming if you happen to have Asiatic that it's the others. So again, the chafer has that deep Y, and June beetle has more of an oval for a raster pattern.
You guys really do have great jobs. Okay, so but also
sarcasm on that one.
That's right. Yeah. I just have visions of the two of you with, looking very closely at these things. But I mean, it is important, and to that point, so anyone who is watching, or any of you in Ontario, if you've got grubs, start taking a closer look and send them to Tracey if you've got questions, because she loves getting grubs in the mail, I heard. Anyway, John, I'm sure that you do as well. Okay, we don't have a ton of time left, so we would be remiss if we didn't talk about wireworm. There are, of course, 100 different pests we could talk about, but we're trying to focus very much on this early season window, and which ones might be of the biggest concern. So look at those beauties. So now wireworm, John, let's go through just quickly. We need to know that it is wireworm that we are dealing with, and there are some distinguishing characteristics. They are not as hideous as the grubs, but what are we looking for to know that we've got wireworm?
Okay, now they can be another tricky one ID-wise, because first of all, there's lots of different types of wireworms, and they don't all look exactly the same. So size-wise and color-wise, there can be some substantial differences. So the one you've got on your screen here, that's our common one in Manitoba. There's no common name for it. It's called Hypnoides bicolor. It's one, now maybe I'll back up a little bit too. Wireworms, they're the larvae of something called click beetles. And we've got about 100 species of click beetles in Manitoba. And there's, again, a handful of them that can be an issue. Two that are dominant in Manitoba. One thing that is distinct on them, they will have, you can see these three tiny pair of legs in behind the head. So they do have front legs, but they're tiny. You want to turn them over to see that. One thing you'll notice along the middle, there's no legs on the abdomen. There's no little fleshy prolegs like we have on our caterpillars. So if it was a cutworm, you'd have these prolegs. So no prolegs, just front legs. At the back, there's this notch. And pretty much all the cutworms have a notch. It's not always looking
Wow.
exactly the same, but to some degree, they're going to have that little notch there at the back. Usually, um, are there anywhere from about a pale yellow to a deep orange, depending on the species. This one here, our common species, it's more of a lighter yellow color. Prairie grain wireworm, more vibrant, almost an orangey color for the prairie grain wireworm. And because we've got these different species, their life cycle and biology is so different as well. Like this one here in the photo, it'll live for 2 to 3 years in the soil as a larva before it comes out as an adult. So just like some of the June beetles or the grubs, there's certain species that can live longer. The other one I mentioned, prairie grain wireworm, interesting species. If they're stressed, they can live up to 11 years in the soil. It's usually more like 4 or 5. But
Okay.
if they're not finding a lot of food, they've been shown to be able to live up to 11 years. And they can even do something we call a regressive molt, where they will actually molt, but instead of getting bigger, they get smaller. And it's just a survival strategy when, yeah, insects are cool that way. They can do things that seem bizarre. Um, but yeah, it's a survival strategy when times are tough for them. And they can even go, this prairie grain wireworm can even go up to 3 years without food if the moisture is good. So
Wow.
some of them are really hardy. So
Yeah.
that makes it more
So,
challenging.
okay, so I have many questions, but I did realize we do need to pause just quickly and play our last read of the night because it happens to be the Pest and Predators podcast read. And so it fits in beautifully with this conversation. And I want to make sure that people know all about this podcast series because it is fascinating. So, Producer Jay, if you would, and then we'll get back to our conversation on wireworm. The Agronomist is brought to you by RealAg Radio, the Canola School, and the Pest and Predators podcast. This series is where top entomologists highlight the insect field heroes hard at work for Canadian farms. Hosted by Real Agriculture Sean Haney and brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation, Pests and Predators is an in-depth look at the many insects that share our fields. Find out more on Real Agriculture, download the podcast, or visit fieldheroes.ca. It is a super cool series. I highly recommend it. Love hearing about all the really cool insects that are helping us, of course, in the field. Now, Jason Vogt says not to be confused. So wireworm not to be confused with the larva of the stiletto fly. And I think we've got an image of this, John, that you sent along. I think it's like the white. It looks much more white, right?
Yeah, it looks
Tracey
like
was
a
saying
white
yes.
worm. Yeah.
Jay, I don't
Every year
remember what number it is. We'll find it. It's in there somewhere. Go ahead, John.
yeah, I was going to say I get a few people every year sending me photos of these therivid or stiletto fly larvae. They seem to be fairly common here, and they look like more like a white worm. There's absolutely no legs on them. They're fly larvae. There's no legs on them. There isn't that notch at the end, but they can be wireworm sized, I guess, but very pale. One way you can tell them from a wireworm, when you disturb them, if you poke at them, they go snaky. They start squirming like crazy, and
Oh,
just behaviorally, you know, yeah, it's actually really fun and neat,
Cool.
when you poke at them. Um, so yeah, if you're not
okay.
sure, poke at it and make it squirm.
And that's
But yeah,
perfect. Okay.
much paler. Like I said, no legs, but they're actually wireworm predators, the revid larvae.
Okay. So we
So
like them.
don't want to mistake them. Yes, you like them. You should like them. They will eat the
Yes.
wireworms.
Okay. Now, Tracey, wireworm, of course, an issue for Ontario as well. We do have some seed protection, and not necessarily the same as what we used to have. And one of the things that we often hear about is that we don't kill wireworm; we just sort of set it back. So, what does that mean for sort of long-term planning and scouting of this pest?
Yeah, you certainly need to realize that at least the historical seed treatments were just drugging them, keeping them kind of at bay
Okay.
for a bit. Some of the newer chemistries that are coming out now actually do help knock them back and knock back the population. So
Okay.
if you have a history of wireworms, then be more selective in your seed treatments or soil applied to see that activity actually be more effective against them than, for example, the neonics that were just drugging them and making them drunk for a little
Right.
while, and they'd wait till the next opportunity.
Next.
So
Yeah. And which crop are they the biggest pest of for Ontario when it comes to wireworm?
cereals certainly they
Okay.
can be, and then corn,
Yeah.
depending on. And again, in a year like this, where we're planting into pretty warm soils, where they'll be up and active already, yeah, we can see some feeding from them.
Okay. Now, and John, they come up, but then as the season goes on, they go down the soil profile, right? Like they'll eventually sort of move their way out of where we would find them.
They do, yes. They don't like it when the soil gets too dry or too warm. So that's why they are, except for potatoes, they're primarily an early season pest because, again, and they're feeding on seedling plants that time of year as well. But yes, when the soil dries out, warms up, they move deeper. Then they come back up towards the surface later in the summer.
Okay. Now, what does it's been a long time since I've walked cereal fields that had damage, but I can distinctly remember walking a barley field where we found damage. So, what does damage look like with if there's been wireworm feeding, say in a cereal field in those seedlings?
So with wireworms, all the feeding is below ground. They will feed on the roots and the seed, and maybe that hypocotyl part that is growing out of the seed, but not above ground. So
Mm.
that's where they're feeding. Now, when the new leaves come up, sometimes they're a bit shredded. They can be discolored. So you will see that there's been feeding on them, or you may just get bare patches where
Mm-hmm.
things have just died. And that's more commonly what draws people's attention is all of a sudden you're seeing bare patches and it can be very confusing. It wasn't just poor germination. Sometimes wireworms damage is hard to diagnose, and I have a feeling it's probably underdiagnosed because probably
Mm-hmm.
a lot of what really is wireworm damage gets called other things because people don't know. So in that
Mm-hmm.
case, you have to dig around a bit. You have to be digging in the soil to find the wireworms. And again, depending on when you're doing this, you may have to go down a little bit to actually find them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One way you can do it, if the soil isn't all sticking together, you can have a big tray or something, scoop some soil into it, shake it a bit to kind of smoothen things out and look for the wireworms. You can put it through sieves. I've done that before. There's different ways you can do it and look for them, or just take a spade or something and turn over the upper levels and start going through.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the important thing is to look for and find the wireworms, just to um, put one and one together and know that what you are seeing is actually wireworm feeding. Now,
Mm-hmm.
if you do notice that, yes, we've got significant wireworm feeding, unfortunately, you can't do anything this year.
Right.
As Tracey mentioned, it's seed treatments mainly that we're using as far as chemical control goes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's next year. You have to know that we had wireworm patches there. Wireworms can spend more than 1 year in the larval stage. So if you're
Okay.
putting a wireworm sensitive crop back into that field, uh, think seed treatments for the following year.
Mm-hmm. Now I haven't mentioned the F word, flea beetle, in this show, and that's because really they kind of get their own show. So we'll be touching on that as well. But they, of course, would be another early pest, but at least they're distinct. At least we know what we're looking at when we look at those. Tracy, we've got a question here from Mr. Johnson. Wants to know if you're going to mention stink bugs. The brown did we say marmorated?
Marmorated, yeah.
Marmorated.
That one
Okay, I looked
specifically,
it up.
yeah,
Yeah, but stink bugs in general are
yeah,
they're very pretty. I'll give you
yeah.
that one. Stink bugs are neat looking. They
Sure,
are.
okay.
They're very architecturally
Yes,
interesting.
you're
Let's put
right.
it that way.
And they're very
Okay.
distinct that way,
They
for
are
sure.
very distinct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Um,
they are becoming more prevalent.
okay.
Absolutely. I see not just brown marmorated. And what's odd about that one is that it hasn't been causing significant damage yet here, even though it's
Okay.
still considered in a mid-Atlantic and East Coast pest problem. They're definitely
Okay.
overwintering all across Ontario, so there's opportunity.
Okay.
They
Yeah.
just haven't made that leap as much. But I would say the stink bug complex will be probably our future problems going forward, in that they're just there and present. And most of them, except for a few that are early season, most of them want that fruiting body, whatever it is on the plant, corn, ear, pod on the beans. So they're going to thrive, and I think they're going to have a longer season to be able to thrive, especially if we are planting early and having a bit longer period in reproductive there, with longer hybrids. Then yeah, they're going to, and they're one that you don't always notice until you see the damage at the end, and not necessarily
Right.
the pest in the field.
Yeah, which is a tough one.
Mhm.
Question here about green cloverworm, John. Are we worried about green cloverworm overwintering in Manitoba?
Short answer is no. Their
Okay.
range where they overwinter is significantly south of us. So they should not be overwintering here. Now, we did have a milder than normal winter, but I still don't expect that we should be seeing any significant overwintering of green clover, if any at all, in
Okay.
Manitoba. They're one that they're really hard to predict because it really does depend on them coming up on the winds.
Right.
Last year, we did have quite a few. Um, they go through these two cycles of larvae, and that the second cycle was fairly large last year, but there wasn't a lot of spraying, just a little bit. I think the plants were big enough that soybeans produce a lot of leaves and actually can
Mhm.
tolerate quite a bit of defoliation.
Right.
So they were present, but there wasn't really a lot of spraying. I got a lot of calls from people in September because when they were harvesting their soybeans, it was just incredible, the moth population in the field. And the photos or samples I got, it was all green cloverworm. So there was certainly a lot of moths around, but they should be all killed off by the winter, and we would be starting fresh
Yeah.
next year.
Okay. Tracey, this is my question because I'm terrified of them, but spider mites were an issue last year. Were they not? See?
Uh,
That, yeah.
they weren't
So
that
always
bad
a
last
question.
year,
Okay.
but I'm anticipating again.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm a Debbie Downer, but all we need, we've already got the heat. We just need
Right.
the drier conditions, and
Okay.
then we are
Yeah.
going to have a problem, especially with, a fair number of the population that we're finding being already resistant to dimethoate,
Okay.
and us not really having another option
Yeah.
that's registered to use on soybeans. One interesting thing is that we are going to start testing out predatory mites via drone to
Cool.
release and see if we can
Really?
find a solution in that way. So yeah,
Please.
that's one interesting, exciting thing. So
Okay.
we're going to see a lot
Please
of
get
mites this year.
video of that.
Yeah,
Release the mites.
yeah.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, okay. That's super cool. You guys have the greatest jobs. Okay, so Kevin says go Canucks go. I agree with that one. No one mentioned the Leafs, and
yeah.
yeah, and I don't care, everybody. So that's great. As you'll see, I have my sons who are golfing right now. So there you go. Anyway. Okay, that's all the time we've got for tonight. Sorry, Alan, we probably need to do a whole show on grasshoppers. But yes, if you find one right now, we've already covered this. Very important. Right now, they're not pest species. Couple weeks before those pest species emerge. So there you go. Thank you, John. Thank you, Tracey, for joining me. This was a lot of fun and very informative. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks
Okay,
for having us.
thank you.
All right. And thank you, everyone, for your great questions and comments and for following along. We'll be back, of course, 8-ish Eastern next week. We're going to be talking some forage because, well, once a year I get to talk about forage. So that'll be next week. Thank you so much for following along. Head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomist to get those CU credits. And we'll see you next time. Cheers, everybody.